The morning mist clung heavily to the grass of Lexington Green on April 19th in the year 1775. Several dozen local militiamen stood in loose formation, clutching their muskets with trembling hands as they watched the approach of 700 disciplined British regulars. The redcoats marched with mechanical precision, and their bayonets gleamed ominously under the pale dawn light. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines rode forward and shouted for the rebels to disperse and lay down their arms. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of history about to fracture. Nobody knows who pulled the trigger first on that fateful morning, but the sudden crack of a musket shot shattered the stillness and changed the world forever. This single moment ignited a conflict that had been simmering for over a decade between the American colonies and the British Empire. The stakes could not have been higher for the men standing on that green, or for the families waiting anxiously in their homes nearby. Defying the crown was not merely a political disagreement, it was an act of high treason punishable by death. The British Empire possessed the most powerful military force on the planet, with a vast navy and a professional army that had conquered nations across the globe. The colonists, in contrast, were a disorganized collection of farmers and merchants with no central government and no standing army. They faced the terrifying prospect of losing everything they owned and their very lives. News of the bloodshed at Lexington and the subsequent skirmish at Concord spread like wildfire throughout the 13 colonies. From the rocky coasts of Massachusetts to the humid plantations of Virginia, riders carried the message that war had officially begun. Thousands of ordinary men grabbed their hunting rifles and powder horns to march toward Boston, where the British forces had retreated. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were fueled by a fierce desire to protect their liberties. The British assumed that a show of force would quickly quell the rebellion, but they severely underestimated the resolve of a people who had grown used to governing themselves. The road to independence would be long and bloody. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress gathered in May of 1775 to address the escalating crisis. The room was filled with tension as delegates from different colonies debated their next move. Some still hoped for reconciliation with King George III, while others argued that independence was the only viable path forward. Amidst these heated debates, a tall and reserved Virginian named George Washington sat quietly in his military uniform. He was a man of few words, but his imposing presence commanded respect. Recognizing his experience and leadership qualities, the Congress unanimously appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Washington accepted the role with a heavy heart, knowing the immense challenges that lay ahead. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take command of the ragtag forces besieging British-occupied Boston. What he found was a chaotic assembly of undisciplined militias, lacking uniforms, gunpowder, and basic supplies. Disease was rampant in the camps, and morale fluctuated with the weather. The British troops inside the city were well fed and supported by the Royal Navy, which controlled the harbor. Washington faced the daunting task of transforming this disorderly mob into a fighting force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British Army. He imposed strict discipline and organized the camp while constantly pleading with Congress for more resources. It was a test of patience, and that would define his leadership throughout the war. While Washington organized the army, the first major battle of the war erupted on the Charlestown Peninsula across the harbor from Boston. On June 17, 1775, British forces launched an assault against colonial fortifications on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. The British Commander General William Howe expected the rebels to flee at the sight of his advancing lines. Instead, the colonists waited until they could see the whites of the enemy eyes before unleashing a devastating volley of fire. The British ranks were mowed down in horrific numbers. Although the British eventually captured the hill after the Americans ran out of ammunition, the battle was a Pyrrhic victory. The colonists had proven they could stand and fight. The stalemate at Boston continued through the harsh winter of 1775 into 1776. Washington knew he needed heavy artillery to drive the British out of the city. In a remarkable feat of logistics, a young bookseller turned artillery officer, named Henry Knox, orchestrated the transport of captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Oxen dragged the heavy guns on sledges over 300 miles of snow-covered mountains and frozen rivers. When the cannons finally arrived, Washington positioned them on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. The British awoke to find themselves under the threat of bombardment. Realizing their position was untenable, the British evacuated the city on March 17, sailing away to Halifax. Despite the victory in Boston, the political situation remained uncertain. Many colonists were still hesitant to break entirely from the British Empire. However, public opinion began to shift dramatically with the publication of a pamphlet titled Common Sense by Thomas Paine in January 1776. Paine used simple and direct language to argue that it was contrary to nature for a continent to be governed by an island. He attacked the concept of hereditary monarchy and urged Americans to embrace independence and republican government. The pamphlet sold over 100,000 copies and was read in taverns and public squares across the colonies. It galvanized the spirit of rebellion and prepared the public for the final break. By the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress could no longer delay the inevitable decision. A committee of 5 men, including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, was appointed to draft a formal statement justifying the separation. Jefferson secluded himself in a rented room and penned the Declaration of Independence. His words captured the Enlightenment ideals of natural rights, asserting that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document was not just a proclamation of war, but a revolutionary statement of human rights that would echo through the centuries. On July 4th, the Congress formally adopted the Declaration. The euphoria of independence was short-lived as the British Empire struck back with overwhelming force. In August 1776, a massive British fleet arrived in New York Harbor, carrying 32,000 troops. This was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent abroad. Washington and his inexperienced army of 19,000 men were dug in on Long Island and Manhattan. The British under General Howe launched a flanking maneuver on Long Island that caught the Americans completely by surprise. The Continental Army was routed and panic spread through the ranks. Washington watched in despair as his soldiers fled before the disciplined British bayonets. It seemed the revolution might end almost as soon as it had begun. Trapped on Brooklyn Heights with the East River behind him and the British Army in front, Washington faced total annihilation. A dense fog miraculously descended upon the harbor on the night of August 29th, shielding the American movements from British view. In a masterstroke of retreat, Washington ferried his entire army across the river to Manhattan without losing a single life. It was a brilliant escape that saved the Continental Army to fight another day. However, the loss of New York City was a severe blow. The British occupied the strategic port and would hold it for the remainder of the war, using it as their primary base of operations in North America. The months that followed were a desperate time for the American cause, known as the darkest days of the Revolution. Washington was chased across New Jersey by the British forces, his army dwindling with every mile due to desertion and expiring enlistments. By December, the Continental Army was reduced to a few thousand freezing and starving men. The British believed the rebellion was all but crushed and prepared to settle into winter quarters. Thomas Paine, who was traveling with the army, wrote The American Crisis during this retreat. His words: "These are the times that try men's souls," were read to the troops to boost their flagging morale. Washington knew he needed a victory to keep the army from dissolving. In a bold gamble, Washington decided to strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas night in 1776, amidst a ferocious winter storm, the Continental Army began crossing the ice-choked Delaware River. The operation was dangerous and behind schedule, but Washington pushed his men forward. Wet and shivering, they marched 9 miles through snow and sleet to reach the town. The Hessians, who were German mercenaries hired by the British, were caught completely off guard. The Americans attacked with a fury born of desperation, capturing over 900 prisoners with minimal losses. It was a stunning reversal of fortune that revitalized the hopes of the Patriots. Washington followed up his victory at Trenton with another success at Princeton a week later. He outmaneuvered the British forces sent to trap him slipping away in the night to attack their rear guard. These two victories in New Jersey became known as the 10 Crucial Days. They proved to the world and to the Americans themselves that the Continental Army was a capable fighting force and that General Washington was a resourceful commander. The British were forced to withdraw from much of New Jersey, and the Revolution was saved from the brink of collapse. As winter settled and the army went into quarters at Morristown, having regained their confidence. The British strategy for 1777 focused on isolating New England, which they viewed as the heart of the rebellion. General John Bergen proposed a plan to march an army south from Canada to Albany, New York, where he would meet up with forces coming north from New York City. This pincer movement was intended to cut the colonies in two. However, the plan was fraught with communication errors and logistical nightmares. Bergen began his march with a massive baggage train that slowed his progress through the dense wilderness. Meanwhile, General Howe in New York City decided instead to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital, leaving Bergen without his expected support. As Bergen slogged through the forests of upstate New York, American resistance stiffened. Militia units felled trees across the roads and destroyed bridges to harass the British advance. The two armies finally clashed near Saratoga in September and October. The battles were fierce and bloody, with American sharpshooters targeting British officers. One of the heroes of the engagement was Benedict Arnold, who led a daring charge that broke the British lines despite having been relieved of command. Arnold's leg was shattered in the attack, but his bravery was undeniable. The Americans, led by General Horatio Gates, surrounded Bergen's exhausted and depleted army, forcing them to surrender on October 17th. The victory at Saratoga was the turning point of the American Revolution. It was a decisive win that captured an entire British army and convinced foreign powers that the American cause was viable. Benjamin Franklin, who had been in Paris lobbying for support, used the news of Saratoga to secure a formal alliance with France. King Louis XVI, eager to weaken his longtime British rival, agreed to provide money, troops, naval support, and gunpowder to the Americans. The entry of France into the war transformed the colonial rebellion into a global conflict, forcing Britain to divert resources to defend its own shores and other colonies. While diplomacy succeeded in Paris, the Continental Army faced its greatest trial at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania during the winter of 1777 and 78. The soldiers suffered from a severe lack of food, clothing, and shelter. Many men wrapped their feet in rags, leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they performed their duties. Disease and malnutrition claimed the lives of over 2,000 soldiers. Washington remained with his men, sharing their hardships and doing everything in his power to procure supplies from a reluctant Congress. It was a crucible of suffering that forged a deep bond between the soldiers and their commander. Amidst the misery of Valley Forge, a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben arrived to offer his services. He spoke no English but possessed a genius for drill and discipline. Von Steuben simplified the complex Prussian military manuals and taught the Americans how to march in formation, handle their muskets efficiently, and use the bayonet. He trained a model company, which then trained other units, spreading the new standards throughout the army. By the time spring arrived, the survivors of Valley Forge had been transformed into a disciplined professional fighting force. They emerged from the winter encampment, ready to face the British regulars on equal terms. The new discipline of the Continental Army was tested at the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778. As the British Army evacuated Philadelphia and marched back toward New York, Washington ordered an attack on their rear guard. The battle took place in sweltering heat, with many men on both sides collapsing from heat stroke. The initial American attack faltered due to confusing orders from General Charles Lee, but Washington rode onto the field and rallied the troops. The Americans stood their ground in a long artillery duel and infantry fight. The battle ended in a draw, but the Continental Army had proven it could stand toe-to-toe with the British in open combat. With the war in the north reaching a stalemate, the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies in 1778. They believed that there were more loyalists in the south who would rise up to support the crown. The British captured Savannah, Georgia, and then set their sights on Charleston, South Carolina. In May 1780, the British laid siege to Charleston and forced the surrender of over 5,000 American troops. It was the worst American defeat of the war. The British then moved into the interior of South Carolina, aiming to pacify the countryside and restore royal authority. The war in the South was brutal and bitter, often pitting neighbor against neighbor in a civil war between patriots and loyalists. British officers like Banastre Tarleton became infamous for their ruthless tactics, including the slaughter of surrendering troops. This brutality backfired as it incited the local population to take up arms against the occupiers. Partisan leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, launched guerrilla attacks on British supply lines and patrols. Marion and his men would strike quickly from the swamps and forests, and then vanish before the British could respond, effectively disrupting their operations. Congress sent General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to take command of the Southern forces and stop the British advance. However, Gates suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Camden in August 1780. His army was routed by Lord Cornwallis, and Gates fled the battlefield, leaving his men behind. The American cause in the South seemed on the verge of total collapse. Washington decided to replace Gates with his most trusted subordinate, General Nathanael Greene. Greene understood that he could not defeat Cornwallis in a head-on battle, so he adopted a strategy of attrition. Greene divided his small army, forcing Cornwallis to split his own forces. This led to the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780, where a force of American frontiersmen destroyed a loyalist militia led by a British officer. It was a significant victory that boosted patriot morale in the backcountry. Then in January 1781, American General Daniel Morgan won a brilliant tactical victory at the Battle of Cowpens. Morgan used the terrain and the aggressive nature of Tarleton's troops against them, executing a double envelopment that decimated the British force. These victories began to wear down the British strength. Cornwallis, infuriated by the defeat at Cowpens, burned his baggage train to move faster and chased Greene's army across North Carolina. Greene led Cornwallis on a grueling pursuit known as the Race to the Dan, engaging in skirmishes, but avoiding a decisive engagement until he was ready. The two armies finally met at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. Although Cornwallis held the field at the end of the day, he lost a quarter of his men. Greene retreated with his army intact, leaving Cornwallis with a battered force deep in hostile territory. The British general famously remarked that another such victory would ruin him. Exhausted and in need of supplies, Cornwallis decided to march his army to the coast of Virginia, hoping to link up with the Royal Navy. He established a base at the tobacco port of Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, Washington was planning an attack on New York City with his French allies, led by the Comte de Rochambeau. However, when Washington received word that a massive French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was heading for the Chesapeake, he saw a golden opportunity. He abandoned the plan for New York and secretly marched his combined American and French army south to trap Cornwallis. The movement of the Allied army was a marvel of deception and logistics. They marched hundreds of miles while keeping the British in New York, convinced that an attack on the city was imminent. By the time the British realized what was happening, it was too late. In early September, the French fleet defeated the British Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, gaining control of the bay. This naval victory was crucial as it cut off Cornwallis's escape route by sea and prevented reinforcements from reaching him. Cornwallis was now trapped between the French fleet and the approaching Allied army. Washington and Rochambeau arrived at Williamsburg and joined forces with the Marquis de Lafayette, who had been shadowing Cornwallis. The Allies marched to Yorktown and laid siege to the British position in late September 1781. The combined French and American forces numbered over 16,000 men, outnumbering Cornwallis 2-1. They began digging parallel trenches, inching their heavy artillery closer to the British lines. The bombardment began on October 9th, turning the town into a smoking room. Washington himself fired the first American gun, signaling the beginning of the end. To complete the siege lines, the Allies needed to capture two key British fortifications, known as Redoubts No. 9 and No. 10. On the night of October 14th, a daring assault was launched. French troops attacked Redoubt No. 9, while American light infantry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, assaulted Redoubt No. 10. The soldiers unloaded their muskets and attacked with bayonets only to maintain the element of surprise. They scaled the parapets under heavy fire and overwhelmed the defenders in less than 30 minutes. The capture of these redoubts allowed the Allies to bring their cannons within point-blank range of the British inner defenses. With his escape routes blocked, his supplies running low, and his position under constant bombardment, Cornwallis realized the situation was hopeless. He attempted a desperate evacuation across the York River under the cover of night, but a sudden storm scattered his boats. On the morning of October 17th, the 4th anniversary of the victory at Saratoga, a British drummer boy appeared on the parapet beating a parley. The guns fell silent. An officer waved a white handkerchief, signaling the desire to surrender. Negotiations began and terms were agreed upon. The war that had started on a village green in Lexington was effectively ending in a tobacco port in Virginia. On October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to lay down their arms. They walked between two lines of Allied soldiers, the French on one side in their white uniforms, and the Americans on the other in their blue and hunting shirts. Cornwallis' pleading illness sent his second-in-command General Charles O'Hara to surrender his sword. O'Hara attempted to present it to Rochambeau, but the French general pointed him toward Washington. Washington, refusing to accept the sword from a subordinate, directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. Legend says the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Although fighting continued in some areas and on the high seas, the surrender at Yorktown marked the end of major military operations in North America. The British Parliament voted to cease offensive operations, and peace negotiations began in Paris. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, officially ending the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and ceded vast territories stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. It was a diplomatic triumph that secured the future of the new nation and validated the sacrifices of the past 8 years. With the war over, Washington faced one final act of leadership. Many in the army and the public wanted him to seize power and become a king or a dictator. Instead, Washington appeared before the Continental Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, on December 23, 1783. In a scene that brought tears to the eyes of the delegates, he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned his power to the civilian authority. King George III, upon hearing that Washington intended to return to his farm, famously remarked that if he did so, he would be the greatest man in the world. The American Revolution was more than just a military conflict, it was a radical experiment in self-governance. A group of diverse colonies had come together to defeat the mightiest empire on earth, not for conquest, but for an idea. They had fought for the belief that power comes from the consent of the governed, and that all people possess inherent rights that no government can take away. The road ahead would be difficult, with the challenges of building a new nation and living up to the ideals of the Declaration, but the foundation had been laid. The world had indeed turned upside down, and a new era of liberty had begun.